I was in kindergarten, and I had seen the blockbuster hit The Goonies a number of times. 3 of you agree with me. Great. That's good. For those of you who don't have any idea what I'm talking about, you just Google it, Goonies. There's this one, yeah. You can start shouting all of them if you want. It's fine. That's right. I was wondering where that was. I don't know. Was that Wes? I don't know. I'm not sure. Sounds like something Wes would do. I don't know. There's this one particular scene where they're making their way to the treasure. And this one guy, I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but he says, hey, he kind of gets going back. He's doubling back, and he's kind of putting things in order. And like, hey, come on, what are you doing? What are you doing? He said, I'm setting booty traps. And they're like, booty traps? And he said, booty traps. And you mean booby traps? He's like, that's what I said. Right? And so anyway, I don't know if y'all remember that part. So that part stuck out to me. I was like, I want to set not booty traps, but booby traps. That's what I want to set. And so when I was in kindergarten, we had these large, giant wooden blocks. I don't know how giant they are because I'm not sure how tall I was actually in kindergarten. As a kindergarten, they were enormous. And you could build an actual house of it. Well, like a house for a kindergartner. You could build out of them, and they were hollow in between, so they weren't too heavy, but they were super sturdy, and so you could build structures, you could build bridges, all these things. I don't know if there was no supervision, but that's what we would do. We would get there early or stay late for after school, and we could build these huge fortresses. And so I wanted to make booby traps inside the fortress. And so there's this one guy, his name was Matt, and so I always wanted to get him with my booby traps. What I didn't realize was eventually they catch on, but this one particular time, I came up with this brilliant plan, and maybe this is from like Roadrunner and what's Coyote, you know what I'm talking about? That's right. Maybe that's where I got it from, I'm not sure, but I had this thing where they had not only blocks, but these long boards, like 6 foot, 10 foot long, probably not, probably 2 or 3 foot, but remember, we're kindergarten. So these enormous boards, and so I would create a bridge for him to walk over that looked just like the next bridge. However, on this next bridge, the little actual plank wouldn't be attached to anything on the other side. It would look like it's attached, incredibly similar to the first bridge he walked over, which was at least 8.5 feet or 16 inches off the ground. And so, as he walked over the first one, I was like, yeah, I built this super sturdy bridge, spent all day. I civil engineered this bad boy. You know what I'm talking about? I don't know if that's the right field of study, but that's what I did. And so he would then walk over this next piece, and I got him good. He took one single step and went a-tumbling. The whole thing crashed in around him, and I was standing there like, got you with my booby trap, baby. I got in trouble. I didn't get a star that day. I didn't get a star. I remember moments like that. I enjoy building things. One of my favorite things to build are teams. What I've come to realize is that I'm not a great builder, but God is. When I build things, people fall. Even when I don't mean to set traps, they still end up covered in rubble. But when I get out of the way and we begin to simply build what God wants to build, man, we have seen some incredible things. World history. It's 586 BC. Babylon conquers Jerusalem. Babylon conquers Jerusalem, and immediately they have this thought: we want to take the best that Jerusalem has to offer, and we want to make it part of our culture. So get the best, the brightest, the smartest, the most handsome, the prettiest, all those things. Get everything we can together, everything that's good from the Jewish people, and bring them. We're taking them to Babylon. We're going to exile them to another place, right? We fast forward just a few decades, 539 BC. Persia then conquers Babylon. And so all these Jewish folks, the best and brightest, they were in Babylon. Now Persia has taken over. right? So now they got everything that Babylon owned and everything that Babylon was, which included the best and the brightest from the Jewish people. Fast forward a number of decades. There's a king named Artaxerxes, a Persian king. We're in the middle of the 5th century BC. And he has a cupbearer, a guy who tastes his drinks and food before he eats it to make sure it's not poison. This is important to Artaxerxes. His father was actually assassinated by one of his servants that he could not trust, evidently. And so Artaxerxes, he invested heavily into understanding and knowing who the people he had closest to him were. For a king in these days, your cupbearer, man, one of the most important people you had. If you could get to the cupbearer, you could get to the king. Nehemiah was Jewish. His family, way back when, was exiled and then survived the conquest of the Persian Empire. Was then born into a place and went up the ranks and is now one of the most trusted men in the court of the king of Persia. And news comes to Nehemiah that his homeland, Jerusalem, is in ruins. In fact, it says this. If you're going to follow along, we will be in the book of Nehemiah this morning. Nehemiah is in the Old Testament. And so our Bible is kind of split up into two parts. The New Testament, which talks everything about Jesus and his life and the things that happened as a result of his life. The Old Testament is everything that led up to the birth of Jesus. It still talks a ton about Jesus. It just tells about what he will be. There's tons of prophecies that happen in the Old Testament. And so that's where we're going to kind of hang out in this book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. So if you want to Google that for later, or if you want to mark it in your Bible app or open it and put a little, whatever these fancy bookmarks things, you can put that there and you can go back and read it. We're going to start with Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. Here's the news. This is Nehemiah talking. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province, or in other words, back to Jerusalem, back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So Nehemiah is hearing this. Now, this isn't like brand new news. They were conquered a number of years ago. And so there was no wall then anyway. But people have attempted to restore what was happening. People are moving back to their homeland. People are going back to where they're from. And so this once great, incredible nation, their walls are in ruins. The gates are burned down. It's like there's no identity for a city. And back in those days, this wall that would go around the city would create these boundaries, and within it was this economic boom that would happen inside the city walls. It brought protection. It brought everything that you would think that a wall around an ancient city would, like a castle or a moat, right? And so he hears these things and he says, man, the identity of the people that I love and care about, where I'm from, that wall of protection is broken down. And he responds. Chapter 1, verse 4 says this, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now I want to stop just for a moment. Because when we talk about ancient civilizations and we talk about their identity with where they're from and the cities, it's much larger than we are here today. For instance, if we go back to 9/11, right? We go back to 9/11. The time that kind of went right after 9/11, everyone had flags up. Everyone was like, man, I'm proud to be an American. All those kind of things. Like all that was happening. And slowly it has faded. Some 18 years ago, it kind of fades. And sometimes this tragedy kind of would unite us, but then it would kind of just fade from our lives. Back in this time, there was no fading. It was who you were all the time. There was nothing that would change that. And so this is a huge deal to them, right? Not only was it the country he was from, it was also supposed to be God's city. So it wasn't only this national identity that sat with him, it was also this religious identity that the city of God was in ruins. That the city of his God was in ruins. That the city of the God he gave his entire life to was in ruins. And so he hears news that his people are returning to their home and they're returning to ruins and they can't do anything about it. And it brings him to a place of mourning. Did you notice his first response to really terrible news? I'll read that again, chapter 1, verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now I get it, we're pretty good at the mourning part, right? We actually do a decent job at mourning. You know, when things don't go our way, we have the capacity to get upset. Some of us even do. We do sit down and mourn. Others of us, maybe me, throw things. I don't know. I don't know how you mourn. I don't throw really hard things. You know, squishy Nerf balls is fine, right? Sometimes our mourning becomes pity parties, though, don't they? Where we've had enough time to process it emotionally and we just would rather just sit in it. He didn't have time for that. He immediately said, hey, I sat down and I wept, I mourned, and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. Fasting and praying. Fasting is defined, well, it's a spiritual discipline. It's something that's not talked about a ton. Let me give you the definition of fasting. Deliberate and generally prolonged abstention from eating and sometimes drinking as a means of humbling oneself before God. He said, hey, I'm going to give it up, this food, sometimes drink, in exchange for time with God. We are focusing on what it is you're chasing, whatever it is he's laying in front of you. And you purposefully say, hey, I'm going to go without so that I'm going to empty myself so that you can then fill me with something of substance. He says, I've got this bad news. It brings me to a place of mourning. It brings me to a place of tears. It brings me to a place of sadness, right? All those things, but I'm going to do something about it. I'm gonna kind of take away from what I enjoy and the things that I think are great. This food thing that I look forward to 3-4 times a day, right? That kind of thing, I'm gonna take that away, and in its place, I'm gonna spend time with God. I'm gonna empty myself so there's space for him to fill me with what he's doing. He says he does it before God. He put himself in a place of saying, hey, I know just feeling sorry for it is not the answer. I have to figure out what to do about it. And I don't know what to do, so I've got to spend time with God and ask the question. And the very best way for me to be in a place to receive God's answer is for me to go without so that he can give me something I do not have. His second response, he has an audience with the king some days later. And as he's with the king can tell that things just aren't right. He can see it. I mean, him and the king are close. They have a relationship. And so he can see it and just the demeanor that Nehemiah has. And the king just asks him, he's like, hey, I've never seen you this way. What is going on with you? And it's then that Nehemiah decides to take a step of faith, to ask a conquering king, twice removed now, for help to rebuild a wall and gates, to give a city an identity of which he has conquered. And he does. He says, well, it's difficult for me because the place that I love the most on this planet is in ruins. And you know what the king's response is? Well, what do you want? What do you want to do? So Nehemiah says, I want to go rebuild it. I want to go rebuild the wall. And the king says yes. In fact, he gives him papers for safe passage and permission to take timber from the royal forest. He gives him resources. He even sends him army officers and a small militia to take care of him as he makes this massive journey back to Jerusalem. Vision for a mission, check. I'll rebuild the wall. Permission, check. I'll pause for a second. Maybe you're wondering, what does Nehemiah attempting to rebuild the wall from his home country have to do anything with foundation? I'm glad you asked. Each of us receive news. The question becomes, what do we do when we hear the news? Let me give you some news. If you're relatively new with us, this might be new news to you. Here it is. There are thousands of people within a 5-mile radius of where you are sitting that are far from God. Thousands of people within a 5-mile radius of where you're sitting that are far from God. So here's your test. If inside there wasn't a moment, you probably haven't grasped what it means to be far from God. The reality of what it means to be far from God is probably not something you are aware of. I guess here's the better question. Does your heart break for what breaks the heart of God? That's probably the better way to put it. Does your heart break for what breaks the heart of God? And if it does, if your heart does begin to break with what breaks the heart of God, maybe we should take a look at Nehemiah and then ask the question, well, how did he respond to heartbreaking news? He mourned, he fasted, prayed, and then he acted. He mourned, he fasted, he prayed, and he acted. But don't decide yet. There's more to the story. If you look at chapter 3 of Nehemiah, you will see one of the most incredible pieces of literature in the entire Bible. It's remarkable, actually. And in fact, it's a terrible thing to read. I mean, it's incredible. And I almost thought I was going to read it, and I was like, man, I can't pronounce half of the names in chapter 3. So that would be embarrassing for me to read it in front of you. So then, on the Bible app, there's this guy with this really cool voice. I was going to have him read it to you. But then it took him 7 minutes to read chapter 3, and I just didn't think that was a good idea either. However, what I want you to do is, if you've got the Bible app, you need to mark chapter 3 of Nehemiah and let that man read it to you. I'm just telling you, just close your eyes and just let it just kind of get you in. I'm going to tell you what's in chapter 3. It's the list of the team that God builds and puts together to rebuild the entire wall and every single gate of Jerusalem. And here's what you'll notice. It's full of names, occupations, and cities that they're from. Here's your list, kind of broken down in a tiny, tiny piece. On that list, high priests and regular priests. I don't know if they call them low priests. That's what I would do. Like, you're a low priest. High priests and regular priests. There are sons on the list. There are townsmen on the list, perfume makers on the list, daughters on the list, district rulers, countrymen, temple servants, goldsmiths, and merchants on the list. Did you notice something? Wasn't a daggum one a wall builder? None of them. Not one of them. When God put a team together, not one single person in the entire chapter. And you know that they would have put it in there. They put that the girl was a perfume maker. I didn't even know they had perfume back then, you know? None of them wall builders. Not wall builders, but willing. They weren't wall builders, but they were willing. What a team. I'll tell you this, the best teams are the most diverse teams. You can write that down, you can take a picture of it, you can put it in print, you could go write a book on it, because it's the truth. The best teams are the most diverse teams. Diverse in their skill set, diverse in their experience, diverse in their approach. They are Liam Neeson, right? I have a very particular set of skills, right? You do have those very particular set of skills. Just because you haven't discovered it yet doesn't mean God hasn't put it somewhere in you. Christianity, following Jesus, is a lifetime of discovery. And often it takes us quite some time for us to discover what God has hidden in the depths of our soul. And a lot of times it gets covered up with a lot of baggage and gunk and nastiness that we kind of pile on throughout our life, and we put it on top, and it takes some excavating to get to the core of what God did in the beginning. The Bible tells us that God knits us together in our mother's womb. And as he's doing that, he's unlocking and putting these little pieces in all kind of places. That says, man, you're going to need this on this day. I'm already there with you. If you take the time to discover how I've made you and discover who you are, you will do things you never dreamed of because they're God dreams. I don't want a gold medal dream team. I want a God's will dream team. That's what I want to be a part of. It takes some discovery. It takes some digging. But even once you realize and you come to the place of saying, hey, yeah, I want to be a part of the team. I want to be a part of the team that Jesus has ordained as the church. And say, I want to be a part of that. I want to be on that team. Here's the truth. And this is what you know and what I know already. Every single team, regardless of how great they are, will have obstacles. Here's one for Nehemiah. Nehemiah 4:10. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. The project itself had issues. The project that they had to undertake had a ton of issues. You can imagine hundreds of years of destruction and rubble from people attempting to rebuild things and then just getting knocked down again. And the rubble that has sat there, these huge, enormous, massive rocks from war-torn periods of time, just sitting everywhere. They didn't have an excavator or a front-end loader or a bulldozer to come through. They were pulling those things out by hand or strapping it to a donkey and moving it, you know? There was rubble and there was weariness. The team was tired. Not only did the project itself have struggles, there were external struggles. There were foreign nations and enemies. There was one guy in particular, his name was Sanballat. He was the governor of Samaria, a little country or nation at the time that was just a little bit north there. Enemies of the Jewish people at the time. Since the exile, Samaria had kind of been the economic center of the region. When all the Jewish folks that had all the gifts, they left and the city was destroyed, Samaria was the next thing that was happening. And so the guys that ruled it, they loved that Jerusalem was in ruins. The economic center and everything shifted north into Samaria. They loved it. And so when they heard that the walls were going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, they were against it. We find it here in Nehemiah 4:1-3. We'll put it on the screen. When Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and he was incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish it in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from the heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing on it would break down the wall, or their wall of stones." They're just spreading information. We don't like this, but let's be honest. They don't have the gifts or talents. Have you seen their team list? There's no wall builders on it. They've got a girl that makes perfume. If a fox jumped on their wall, it would make the entire thing crumble. They took it a step further. They actually created a plot to kill Nehemiah. I'll tell you this, what teams have to recognize is there will always be haters. Haters gonna hate. What do? Shake it off. No, haters are overcome by great teams. Haters are overcome by great teams. Listen to what Nehemiah did. Nehemiah 4:16-18. From that day on, he heard the news about their plot. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. Great teams protect each other even at the cost of their own personal progress. Nehemiah said, hey, here's the deal. Just because we are having external issues, external obstacles, that doesn't change what God has called us to. And so, we had this idea of how we wanted to complete this wall. We had this vision and this mission of how we wanted to accomplish this goal that God has put in front of us. And things have changed because the world has things that they'll throw at this team that God has assembled and put together. But that doesn't change the mission. It changes how the mission is going to be accomplished. And so instead of two hands and whistling while you worked with one hand on the sword, one hand on a brick. Half as productive. That's the way they did it. The response of the team will do whatever it takes to protect one another and keep moving forward the mission of God. And as if project difficulties and external struggles were not enough, they had their own internal struggles. If you've ever been on a team before, you know that inside the team, everything isn't always great, right? Even when everything from the outside looks like it's perfect and going well, if you're on the inside of the team, you're like, this team got some issues, right? For this particular team, for Nehemiah, they had an issue where they were exploiting the poor. People that had returned from exile, it created a ton of financial instability. It wasn't the economic center that it once was. And so you had people coming from countries far away with generations of just poverty. And they came back to nothing. And maybe their land was there, or maybe it had been taken by someone else. Their trades weren't there. There was nothing to do. The fields weren't there that they left hundreds of years ago. Everything had changed. And so the people that had money, they were taking advantage of their own countrymen, their own cousins and brothers and nephews and uncles, their own neighbors. And so they were loaning to them at insanely high interest rates. People were losing their family lands. They were starving. They even went so far as to enslave their brothers and neighbors' children into their own house as a form of payment for interest. And Nehemiah has this to say to them. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest? So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. That was the exile. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us. They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? He's saying we're better than this. We're better than this. What this teaches us about teams is this: great teams can have hard conversations. Great teams can have hard conversations. If you're new and you see Foundation on the interwebs or Instagram, or maybe you've seen us in a parade or out in the ice cream truck or something like that, and you think, man, it always just looks shiny and polished. It's because we have incredibly difficult conversations regularly, all the time. There's never a moment, and there is no one off limits. Everyone is a part of the team and has to come into a team culture that existed, that God created long before any of us showed up. We have real church life struggles. We do. In our own church, we have real church life struggles. And the church as a whole, globally, the church here, the collective church in Newnan and Coweta County, on the south side of Atlanta, we've got church struggles. We can ask the question, something I ask very often at our Discover Foundation events that we put on the third Sundays of each month. A question I'll ask is, hey, why don't people go to church? Or why have people stopped going to church? It's important that we understand the answer to that question, because as we create a church, as we plant a church here, there are already tons of churches that are here in Coweta County, about 110, right? So what we needed to do, there are thousands of people that don't know Jesus, though, that are not giving any of those churches a chance. So the question is, can we create something that's different to hopefully be an answer to the people who have said, no, I don't want to do church. I don't want to know Jesus. I don't trust Jesus. I don't trust the church. I don't trust God. I don't even know if God exists. People say, I won't go to church because I feel judged. I feel like the moment I walk in, I've got to be like the most perfect person, and I'm not. If that's you today, and someone drug you here, and you're still trying to be perfect, you probably have noticed I'm not all that great at being perfect already. None of us are. You know what I'll tell you over and over again is I want to follow Jesus every moment of my life. Me, personally, I want to. But you know what? You spend enough time with me and you'll realize I don't. You know what that makes me? A hypocrite. I say one thing and I do another. And our church is full of them. It doesn't excuse my poor decisions. It does explain them. From the very beginning, it's easy to see when I mess up. Because usually it's in front of people. People say all the church wants is your money. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry that you feel when you go to a place that they don't care about you, they just care about the size of your bank account. I'm sorry that you felt like if you don't make the little offering bucket, if you got something to put in there, you don't have something to put on your phone, that you don't belong there. I'm sorry that someone has maybe taken funds you've donated to a nonprofit previously and used them in a way that probably wasn't right. I'm sorry. Maybe you've had a negative experience, or your friends have had a negative experience because they had a conversation with a follower of Jesus and that conversation did not go well. Maybe that follower of Jesus was having a terrible day, or maybe it was the norm for them, I don't know. But that conversation just went into a place that made them feel like they were disgusting. And they just said, if that's what people who follow Jesus are like, I don't want anything to do with them. There's real struggles inside the church. A lot of them, we bring them on our own. They're internal things that we do that people who are far from God just have issues with. We say things like this is the way we've always done it, so we'll continue to do it. What we never say is what's really on the end of that statement. This is the way we've always done it. This is the way we'll continue to do it. I don't care if it doesn't work. I just care this is what we've always done. And so if you put those two things on a scale, it doesn't work, and this is what we've always done, this one always wins. Because I'm the one that decides which one has more weight. Where God's going, stop doing stuff that doesn't work. He is. He is. We mess up when we say, hey, community, hey, y'all out there. If you want to hear about Jesus, you come on 10:30 to the high school. We'll be there. When we think lost folks, people who are far from God, they need to come to us. If they knew how valuable Jesus was, they would come to us. Yeah, well, they don't. They don't. So we have to go to them. For the last year, we've said over and over again, people are our destination. People. Church is never our destination. Sunday mornings is never our destination. Sunday mornings are our starting point. If you just can't wait to get to the weekend because, you just need Sunday mornings, you're probably missing out on what God could be doing the other 167 hours He's given you in a week. And so we gather here on Sunday mornings only in a few minutes for us to say, hey, have a great week. God bless you. And that's the starting gun going off. And you need to be coming out of the block saying, what you got for me this week? Who are the people we're running towards? That's what our team must be about. And it must always be about. When we make decisions as a church to please the people in the church, regardless of whether it pleases God. When we begin to say, you know what, if we can just please him or her, God will be pleased with us. When the question should always be, if we can just please God, he should be pleased, she should be pleased, and if they're not, I don't know what to tell you. Like, grab a book bag and go put your thumb up on the street. I don't know. But that's what we chase here. The very first thing you saw when you walked in, lead to Jesus. There is no one in this room that's a part of our team that wants you to come and have an interaction with anyone that stands on this stage more than they want you to have an interaction with Jesus. And people who have been around long enough know that I don't have any capacity or power or any special prayers to give or anything to shake in the right way like this, right? None of it. I ain't got nothing to give. Nothing to give of substance that I'm not just borrowing from God and regurgitating. And every single person that leads anything will tell you the same thing. We are not leading to ourselves. We are not leading to our cause. We are not leading to our personalities or our fame or our platform. We are simply leading to Jesus. What happens when you have a great team that God assembles, that faces the internal and the external obstacles, that understands that the project itself will have issues, and they approach it from a Jesus first? I'll read it to you. Nehemiah 6:15 and 16. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul. In 52 days, when all our enemies heard about this, all surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Great teamwork in the church is evidence of God to a world where division is the norm. You want to begin to show our community really who God is? Around the words of Jesus, you would say, love one another, love your neighbor as yourself, love God, love people. But if we want to break that down into a smaller piece, be an incredible team. Allow them to see a diverse group of people, perfume makers, and goldsmiths, and haircutters, and electricians, and plumbers, and flight attendants, and pilots, and stay-at-home moms, and teachers, and parapros, administrators. Put them all together. Put them all together. None of them labeled kingdom builders. But watch what the community does when you begin to build a kingdom that doesn't have our name on it. When the community begins to see that we are here simply for the pleasure of Jesus. And as a result, he blesses the community. Yeah, our enemies, they will lose their self-confidence because they'll recognize that what God is building has nothing to do with the men and women involved, but everything to do with who he is. What is our broken-hearted moment? If you were to go to the square and you were to sit on the steps of the courthouse, within 5 miles, there's 59,125 residents in a 5-mile radius. I've gotten 2 studies back. The lowest number is 64%, highest number 73%. Between 64 and 73% of those 59,125 residents do not have a relationship with Jesus. That's an enormous amount of people. Does your heart break for what breaks the heart of God? Today, there are people in need of rebuilding. Today, there are lives in need of reconstruction. We've been given the opportunity. We should pause. Some of you have been paused. Some of you have been in the mourning stage way too long. And it's time for you to say, hey, it's time for me to do some acting. It's time for me to have some action to go along with the heartbreak that I have. Some of you need to spend some serious time fasting and praying, saying, God, I'm going to give up this so that you can fill that spot with something that you want. That I'm going to spend some intentional time setting aside something that's ordinarily consumed by me so that I can consume something extraordinary from you. I'm going to set that time aside, and then I want to step into, go forward with being a part of the team that God has built. If you're sitting here today and a part of Foundation, I'll be honest with you, God did not bring you here to simply change you or your family, but so that you or your family would have the ability to change others. That the Holy Spirit working and living and moving inside of you, that you would go and rebuild people through the power of God. He doesn't need you to have people changer on your resume. He just needs you to have willing. Willing. There will be obstacles. The task itself will have its own obstacles. There will be external obstacles, internal obstacles that will happen. But just take them one at a time. Just take them one at a time, and then just keep going through them. Know that your team is with you. Know that God has positioned people in and around you that will stand guard as you do your work. And then you will stand guard for them as they do theirs. Let's build people. Let's build something. Don't settle for the dreams you have when you're asleep. Expect God to give you a dream that you can see and comes true when you are wide awake. Because that's not fantasy land. That's the will of God at play and at work inside of our community. And you should be a part of it. One of the easiest ways for you to begin stepping towards willingness is to jump in. Some people ask, hey, I don't see anything about membership at Foundation because we don't have it. We don't have it. We have team members. You know that there's a huge difference between a team member and someone who has membership at a place? You can have membership at a place and you don't actually have to do anything. You just have to say you're a member. But on great teams, everyone contributes. Everyone does their piece because they recognize the mission and the thing that's in front of them is so important. They've got to do their thing. There are some people here that are new to church, or maybe actually probably the people who have been in church the longest, who might allow a thought to slip in their head that whoever's sitting in the nursery today, they don't play as a significant role in the team as maybe Brady is right now playing the killer background music while I close, right? Maybe that's what you might think, and you would be wrong. Not because I say so, because that's what God thinks. Because God sees every single teeny tiny, undercover, behind the scenes, out front job as equal. He designed people to fill a space or a gap in time, to invest themselves in people or in kids that can't even talk yet, that are still wandering around, barely walking or not even walking. And there's kids down there leading groups, or there's parents and adults down there leading groups right now for second graders and kindergartners and first graders, second, third, and fourth, and fifth graders. And those kids are looking at them like, I'm not sure what you're saying, but they're going to say it to them over and over and over again, week after week, year after year. And slowly but surely, the gospel will seep into who they are. There's not a lot of progress seen week to week when you're talking to a second grader about the complexities of the theology of following Jesus. You don't get that. There aren't a lot of light bulb moments to go off and say, you know what? Now they understand atonement and justification. I'm still wrestling with it. But they're pouring in. And they're raising kingdom builders. And they're partnering with families. The people who are holding signs outside as you walk in. Maybe some people might say, what? They don't even have bulletins to hand out. They're just holding signs saying, you look amazing today. Well, maybe you need to learn how to take a compliment. Maybe you do look amazing today. And it isn't because of your outfit, but it's because of your willingness to say, I'm going to go to the starting line this morning. Every single piece matters. Because there are thousands of people who are far from God within 5 miles of where we're sitting. And God is assembling a team to do something about those thousands. Here's the thing you can't lie about. We started this church with numbers. We knew the numbers going into it. This is why we picked this location. And so at some point we have to begin asking, are we moving the needle? Are we seeing people who are far from God come close to Christ? That's what matters. You should join the team. You should allow your heart to break for what breaks the heart of God.